So some of your especially interesting blog posts and articles and books as well have been about the challenge of self-knowledge, of having introspective access to your own properties as a person and even to what you are thinking or feeling or experiencing in your mind at that very moment, that accessing those things is much harder or less reliable than we tend to think it is. And something you actually did this over 10 years ago, but I only just recently discovered you'd done that's really cool, was this collaborative project with, I think he was a psychologist, not a philosopher, named Russell Hurlburt.
Yes. Who
disagreed with you and thinks that, no, in fact, we can have reliable access to our what we're thinking and feeling. And you guys wrote this book together in which it was almost like an adversarial collaboration where you were trying to figure out why, I won't explain your methodology. I'll ask you to do that. But to start off, I'm just curious to hear the basic case for why you think introspection is not reliable and why other people disagree with you.
Right. Yeah, that book was a lot of fun. I'd be happy to talk about it as a really interesting experience and exercise.
So cool. I wish there were more books like that.
Yeah, and so I want to answer the main question that you asked at the end, right?
Yes.
But yeah, the book was just the idea methodologically of getting together with someone who has a very different view from your own, and not just doing pro, con, rebuttal, response, like a couple conversational turns, but actually writing something collaboratively together with hundreds of conversational turns where you're editing the other person's words and they're editing your words and you're really trying to get at the truth of their opinion. That was just really interesting and extremely rare.
I'm swooning here.
Yeah, and Russ was a wonderful collaborator for this. He's very non-defensive in certain ways, very straight and out there. That was awesome. But and we can talk more about that if you want, but let's see. I also want to answer the question about why I think that people have poor self-knowledge.
Yeah.
So I guess I partly got into this because there's this long philosophical tradition of thinking that people have perfect self-knowledge of their own stream of conscious experience as it's occurring within them, right? So the kind of classic example of this, and this is often associated with Descartes and the tradition that comes after him, is, if you're feeling intense pain and you think, am I in pain? It seems kind of impossible that you could be wrong about whether you're in pain or not, right? I mean, how could you be wrong about that?
Right, you could be wrong about whether someone's stabbing you. Maybe you're delusional and you just think you're being stabbed, but if the pain is there in your mind anyway, then you're feeling pain, whether or not you're right about the source
or
of it.
if you're a brain in a vat, right, then you might be wrong. There's no external world out there at all, but at least you're right that you're having these visual experiences as though there's an external world. You can't be wrong about that, right? I'm having this visual experience of red right in the middle of my visual field. How could I possibly be wrong about that?
Right.
So that kind of intuitive appeal, and I think it's often exactly the cases of canonical intense pain and canonical red as experienced in the foveal center of the field. Mm-hmm. Those are the two philosophers' favorite examples, non-accidentally, I think, kind of invite this idea that philosophers have found attractive, that people maybe can't be wrong. They're infallible about their own stream of conscious experience as it's going on through them. And in the 20th century, psychologists had done a good job of bringing up doubts about our knowledge of our attitudes, especially our unconscious attitudes, like from Freud, right? And also the causes of our behavioral choices, like you see with people like Nisbet and Wilson. Mm-hmm. But psychologists had not really, I thought, nailed down the case that we could be radically wrong about our own stream of currently ongoing conscious experiences. And I thought maybe we could, and I was partly led to thinking that maybe we could because I was, at the time I was starting to think about this, I was a graduate student in philosophy, but I was working in Alison Gopnik's laboratory in developmental psychology.
Oh.
And John Flavel was, this was at Berkeley, and John Flavel was, kind of down at Stanford, and I'd been an undergrad at Stanford. And Gopnik and Flavel both thought that children about 3 or 4 years old could just make these whopping mistakes about their own their own experiences, their own attitudes, their own stream of conscious experience, especially in Flavel. And it struck me at the time as odd that I thought Flavel made a good case. And we could talk about the case if you want, but the summary version is I thought Flavel made a good case that 4-year-olds could be radically mistaken about their stream of experience. And it's a little hard to reconcile that with the idea that maybe adults would be completely infallible.
Right. And he wasn't just making the case that they can be wrong because they're bad at communicating. Like they might say, I'm angry, but they don't really even understand what the word angry means. And they're just feeling excited or something.
Right. It's not that in the Flavel. So just like for one example from the Flavel, and he does this in so many different ways. You can just tell that he's trying to like help them find the right answers, and they're just failing over and over again. But like one example is in one experiment, he's got, I think they're 4-year-olds, and he says, I'm going to ring a bell, and he's got a library bell under the desk, and then he waits 5 seconds, and he rings it. And then he says, I'm going to ring the bell again, and then he waits 5 seconds, and then he rings it. Then he says, I'm going to ring the bell again. And then he waits 10 seconds without ringing it. Then he says, are you thinking about anything? Right? A lot of the children will say, no. Right? Are you thinking about a bell? Right? A lot of children will say, no, I'm not thinking about a bell. Right? And it's like, but like, of course they gotta be thinking about the bell, right? And the way he describes it, if I'm recalling correctly, I hope this isn't just my imagination, right, playing tricks on me, but the way he describes it, like, or at least how I picture it, is the children are like, they're like shaking, waiting for this bell to be rung, right? Because this is such a weird thing that this adult is doing, right?
Right.
How could they not be thinking about this?
But can we be confident that they're not just saying like what they think he wants to hear? Or, I mean, this is probably a challenge in trying to perceive people's internal experiences anyway, that we can only get at them through self-report.
Yeah.
But it seems like it might be a bigger problem with children than adults.
Yeah, that's true. And I don't think that experiment is decisive by itself. And maybe the entire body of work of Flavel is not decisive. But to me, it's suggestive, at least. And that's part of what inspired me to think about the adult case, too. And once I started thinking about the adult case, I felt like I did see evidence that we are often quite badly mistaken about our own stream of conscious experience, even as it's ongoing. And the philosopher's tendency to focus on foveal presentation of color in the middle of the visual field and an intense canonical pain.
They're like making it easy for themselves.
They're choosing the two easiest cases, right? So if you just think about something like one of the things that I invite readers to do when I'm making the case for this is form a visual image of their house or their apartment as viewed from the street.
Right.
So, and most people say that they can form these images. Not everybody does, right? But most people say they can. And then think about like how stable is it? Is it fully colored? Is it fully colored all the way into the periphery before you think to assign color to it?
Right.
Is it kind of flat and two-dimensional like a picture would be, or does it have more depth to it? Is it like an image, an afterimage? Where is it located in space, right? So actually, when I've interviewed people about their imagery, some people say, seemingly to their own surprise, I had this visual image, and it seemed like the image was kind of located in front of my forehead. I know this doesn't make any sense, they'll sometimes say, right? Because you'd think the image would be in your head if it's anywhere. Some people will say, yeah, I have a visual image. It's not like that image is anywhere. And some people will say, well, it seemed like it was in my head. And then a substantial minority will say, I know this sounds weird, but it seemed to me like the image was in front of my forehead.
I get that. That makes sense to me intuitively.
Right, but yeah. All right, so there are all these interesting questions about what it's like to experience imagery that I think are non-obvious. And you could imagine people going pretty wrong about some pretty basic structural features of the imagery. You know, in the 70s was part of culture, our culture in the U.S., I think, sometimes to think that memories tended to be black and white, like TV was at the time, right?
Wow.
And if you think about images, memory images, right, I think most people now would not be inclined to think that memory images tended to be black and white.
No.
But when the media, the most kind of salient media were often black and white, people did maybe seem to think that their images and their dreams.
Did people think back then that the memories of people back before any media existed at all were black and white? Or is it just memories were in color, and then suddenly we had black and white TV, and then memories went black and white? And now...
So I haven't... This is actually a personal memory of my own, and I've seen some evidence from it in popular culture, especially in Paul Simon's song Kodachrome is a nice example of this. But I haven't found systematic discussions of memory being black and white in, say, the psychological literature or in journalism. So it's a little hard to evaluate carefully what people were thinking.
It seems
but
impossible.
For the dream case, there was actually a literature that's very interesting about where people in the 50s in the United States, in the 40s, thought that dreams just generally were black and white. And I don't think that they thought this was just dreams in the United States as influenced by media. I think they just thought dreams are a black and white kind of thing.
Wow.
Yeah, most people thought that in the 1950s. And it's related to the presence of media in the culture. So if you look pre-20th century, very few people will say that dreams are black and white. If you look 21st century, very people will say that dreams are black and white. And you look at the arc of it, and it relates to the dominance of black and white film media in the culture. And we got some cross-cultural evidence for this. So this guy, Huang Changbing, emailed me and said, we should try this in China, because this was about the year 2000. He said, well, in rural China, most people are exposed to black and white media. Their TVs are black and white. Whereas in urban China, most people, especially the wealthier people, are exposed to mostly color media.
Right.
So we asked about their dreams, and we found rural people in China in the early 2000s tended to say that their dreams were black and white. And urban people tended to say their dreams were colored.
That is weird. Do you think that any of this problem just generally of people misreporting their internal states could be chalked up to misremembering? Like if you could somehow ask people right at the moment they're having the dream, they would report like, yes, I'm dreaming in color. But then if you ask them like 15 minutes later or something, there's this revising process that happens. And so they remember it having been in black and white, but that's not an issue of like, it's an issue of like, it counts as people being bad at reporting what their recent internal states were. So in that sense, you would be right. But it wouldn't quite violate this sort of almost self-evident notion that people had that you can't be mistaken about feeling a thing or experiencing a thing.
I think that is possible with the dream case. And actually, once REM sleep was discovered and people decided to ask about coloration of dreams by using REM awakening, instead of using retrospective report or kind of, more distantly retrospective report, the rates of colored dream reporting went way up. But that was also, unfortunately, for testing my hypothesis, that was also during the 60s, during which the film media were undergoing quick change in their coloration. So it's a little hard to know whether the change is due to the change in the REM awakening method or the cultural change. But for imagery, right, you're reporting it as it's ongoing.
Right. Or emotions, actually. I'm thinking of, like, someone yelling, I'm not angry! Like, that's definitely...
Yes, that's the classic example, right? And I certainly experienced that. I think, for example, my wife reads my face better than I introspect my own emotional state, right? So if my wife thinks I'm angry...
Better evidence.
I usually
Outside
am.
View, I am angry.
I'm inclined to deny it.
it.
Exactly, right? So even just the basic label of are you angry or not can be hard. But then when you start to think about, okay, well, it's, what an emotional experience is not just the label, but it's like some people think an emotional experience is a state of bodily arousal, right? And exactly what type of bodily arousal would be associated with anger? And is it the same in every case of anger? And to what extent does it involve kind of cognitive stuff versus more literally visceral stuff? I mean, what is it like to be angry, right? So first layer, we don't even know very well whether we are, but second layer, even harder, is like, what is the what is the phenomenology of anger?
So I'm also curious about about the conscious versus unconscious question with anger or with anything you're experiencing. Like, is the claim that people can be wrong about what they're experiencing at that moment, does that boil down into people experience things unconsciously in addition to consciously? And so you are not aware of all the things you're experiencing because some things are unconscious? Or, because that seems like pretty, I mean, I'm like walking into a trap here, but that seems obviously true to me.
That's too charitable.
Or, because like, couldn't you just explain the, I'm not angry person yelling that by saying he's experiencing anger unconsciously? Or are you actually claiming he is consciously experiencing anger and is wrong that he is not consciously experiencing anger?
I'm inclined to say the latter.
Huh.
I don't know what an unconscious experience is. I kind of would use the word experience and consciousness and stream of experience and phenomenology all kind of synonymously to refer to what it's like. I do think one can probably maybe have unconscious emotional states, right? But that's not the kind of case I'm thinking of, right?
Right.
I'm thinking of there is a phenomenological aspect of your experience that's emotional, that's going on with you right now, and it's not just kind of unconscious the way early visual processing might be unconscious, right? It's in there in your phenomenology, in your experience, but you're wrong about it. Why not? Why couldn't that be the case? It seems to me plausible that it's the case when I think about harder cases, like my emotional experience right now. Right, I'm not in an intense emotional experience right now, so it's not like totally vivid to me what my experience is. It's not totally obvious to me what aspects of my phenomenology, what's going on with me right now, viscerally, emotionally. I mean, I can make some guesses, but it seems like it could be wrong.
Yeah.
In the same way, it seems plausible to me that I could be wrong about the features of my visual imagery as I'm thinking about my street as viewed from the house.
Yeah.
I mean, our stream of experience, I think it's plausible to suppose that our stream of experience changes quickly and is complex, and our linguistic and conceptual categories for thinking about it, the tools that we have to think about it, they're really designed for thinking about the outside world and not for introspection. And so we have struggled to get our minds around this swift, shy, changeable, disjointed mass of experience that we have. And when I look at, like, say, this coffee cup in my hand, right, I can tell you all kinds of things about its features, its structure, right? And when I introspect my own emotional state or my own imagery state, right, I can't tell you with nearly the same amount of certainty about its features.
Right.
So this kind of Cartesian picture that we know first and most certainly is our own experience, and what we know kind of secondarily and much less certainly is the outside world. In my view, that's exactly backwards, right? What I know kind of best is like the ordinary things about middle-sized objects around me. And this experience that I have, I don't know that nearly as well. And to the extent I do know it, it's often because I reach inferences about it based on my knowledge of the social world and the physical world around me.
Is a way to resolve the seeming paradox that people can be wrong about what they're consciously experiencing, is a way to resolve that just the modular mind? That, like, there's not one single unified consciousness, and, sort of like, as is highlighted very starkly in cases of patients with damage to their corpus callosum, where, one hemisphere of their brain is, like, aware of some information that was shown to one eye, and the other hemisphere is aware of other information, and they aren't, like, communicating. Could something like that be happening where, like, part of your brain is experiencing the anger and this other part of your brain that's consciously reporting is not even aware of it?
So maybe, but I'm almost inclined to go the opposite direction from that, but in a way that kind of comes around maybe a full circle to a similar conclusion.
Okay.
So I call this the crazy spaghetti view of introspection.
Of course you do. Go on.
So instead of thinking of the mind as modular, I mean, I think there's something to the idea of modularity. especially for early sensory input processes. But instead, I think we've got this massive chaotic tangle of processes going on in our mind that interact and interfere with each other and cooperate, and in this incredibly complex way, instead of like these tight, neat modules that then feed into a center or something like that.
Right.
Right. Instead, think of it as this chaotic tangle of crazy spaghetti, right? And then somehow out of this chaotic tangle comes some kind of self-report. Right. But what's driving that self-report is a whole mix of processes, including your presuppositions about what must be the case, including, just your ordinary linguistic habits, including all kinds of stuff that only some part of which is some kind of sensitivity to what the experience itself is that you're reporting.
Yeah, that's actually pretty plausible. Or that feels like a type of brain that could exist and that would produce the kinds of phenomena that you've been pointing at.
So that's my view. So I've got a little picture of the crazy spaghetti model and in one of my papers, which is basically just a giant tangle. Here's my picture of mine, and then I just have this scribble on the page.
Brilliant artist, brilliant. And I guess last question about this before we wrap up. Did your collaboration with Russ change either of your minds?
Yeah, that's something that's a little hard to know, right?
Makes sense.
Consistently with my skepticism about self-knowledge. Here's one thing I think is true. I think that before I collaborated with Russ, I was on the cusp of going to a very extreme version of skepticism about self-knowledge. And I still have what some people might see as kind of an extreme level of doubt, but I think Russ helped me pull back from going too far to the extreme on that. And I guess I do think that we can have self-knowledge through introspection, and that there are ways to do it, like including Hurlburt's preferred way, that probably do get us a certain amount of knowledge. And I think maybe more than I would have thought.
So your position now would be introspection is much less reliable than many people think, but it's also more reliable than I previously thought.
Yeah, I think
there are ways to do it.
Yeah, I think he did help me moderate. I think I did probably moderate my views somewhat as a result of the collaboration with him, yeah.
Was that because he pointed out approaches to introspection that you hadn't been considering, that you agreed were more reliable, or was it that he convinced you that the approaches you had thought were very unreliable were actually somewhat more reliable?
I think it was something more like, what we did, the way we did this book was we actually we gave this person a beeper, Melanie, and we interviewed her about her experiences when this beep went off at random moments in her life, right? And then she wrote down little notes, and then we asked her what her experience was. And Russ has this wonderful way of asking people about their experience that's very open and non-judgmental and full of openness to possibilities that you might think were crazy or strange or impossible first. And you can kind of hear participants starting with their presuppositions about what experience must be and answering in terms of those, and then Russ pushes back against that and says, well, to me it sounds like you're just assuming this about your experience, and maybe that's right and maybe it's not, but let's beep you again, and here are some possibilities you might consider about what might be in your experience that are different from what you're reporting now, and they might be right and they might be wrong, but just think about it.
Interesting.
So he has this way of doing that, and then people come back the next day and the next day and the next day, and sometimes they shift. And as you see them shifting a little bit away from those first reports, there's something kind of convincing about that sometimes, I think. So I think that's part of what my exercise with Hurlburt did for me. Mm-hmm. And you can kind of see that just playing out in the book. Because we present the dialogue, most of the dialogue, word for word.
That's so great.
As we're interviewing this participant. And then we've got these little side boxes where we argue about what's going on and connect it to existing literature and stuff.
That's so perfect. Yeah, as you say, it's not just you guys make arguments at each other, but you're not both sort of figuratively facing each other. You're facing this real case and sort of collaboratively trying to figure out how to interpret it.
Right.
And reacting both to each other and to the real case. It's wonderful. So, we'll link to that book as well as to your blog